So, welcome to our discussion of Anxious to Talk About It, Chapter 2. Hopefully, you've been able to read along. If you haven't, but still are wanting to hear what the book is saying, I'm glad you are watching today. So, the author starts off Chapter 2 by telling the story of a friend who grew up during segregation and didn't really think at the time it was good or bad, it just was. It's the way things were. She writes, "We all grow up believing in a world in which things are done in a certain way. You do not know the world in any other way than how it first appears to you. Then at some point, things begin to change. At first, the change appears gradually, but in other places, the change appears quickly and dramatically. The world no longer looks to you the way it once had. How do you respond?" It's hard to be more progressive than your societal context when it comes to morality, new ideas, new ways of understanding the world. For instance, in the 15th century, people probably aren't going to have the same ideas we have in the 20th century. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, things have progressed so much, even to the point that even the most kind of forward-thinking people weren't even imagining. There are always a few who are kind of ahead of the game that slowly pull us along, but it's hard to outpace the culture, the society, by very much. Some people are always able to do it a bit, but the rest of society is slow to follow. This is true for everything from new religions to slavery to women's rights and opportunities. Some of you may remember a time when it seemed impossible to have a female pastor. Some of you may have questioned it yourselves early on, and others just assumed it was meant to be that way, only men serving as pastors, because that's the way it was. You never really thought about it any differently. Can you think of a time you questioned the way things were and thought they could be better or different? Can you think of a time you didn't question the way it was, and looking back, you realize that way of thinking was wrong? So in college, I assumed the LGBTQ people that I knew couldn't be members of a church, let alone serve as elders, deacons, or pastors. Before college, I honestly never had even considered the question. In seminary, however, I was actually really introduced to LGBTQ people who felt a call to ministry. I had to truly confront the question for the first time and really dig into why this prohibition came to be. Was it still relevant? Whether it should be changed? I never met a female pastor until seminary. I'm not sure I ever really questioned it. I grew up Methodist and Presbyterian, so it was allowed. I just hadn't seen it. And then I was more active in an evangelical youth group that did not believe in women's leadership in the church. Sadly, I never questioned or challenged that. I basically just went along with it because it didn't seem like my problem at the time, and I was trusting the adults in my life. I now realize I should have noticed the lack of female leadership earlier and questioned those things in college. Sometimes it's just easy to go along with the way things are and not challenge the system, not poke and prod things too much, not try to change things. We assume it's the way it is and it's the way it always will be, or it must be okay because it's the way it is. But if we really look at history, we know that's not true. We progress. Things we believe now, we look back and say, how did we ever used to think this way? How did we allow this to happen? In 100 years, I know society's going to look back at a lot of what I have done and have said and be like, how did he even think those things? I have to come at my life with that humility, knowing there are things now that hopefully I'll change my own views on. But the rest of society is going to look back at where we're at now and wonder why we didn't question things earlier, just as we do for the past ourselves. The author Hessel says that one of the ongoing problems of race is the segregation of white people into isolated circles. We often lack authentic relationships with people of color. We might know some people of color, but are they acquaintances or true shared relationships? She writes, white people's friendships largely remain segregated, and studies have reported that within white people's circles, very few have hosted someone of color or visited someone non-white in their home. The problem is not simply race. The deeper problem is the inability to relate across racial differences. Now, we may not be intentionally segregating ourselves into all white groups, but are we intentionally ensuring we aren't? Would you say your social and professional circles are mostly white relationships? If yes, how do you change that if you think you should? If no, how have you maintained and fostered relationships with persons of color? I admit my social circle right now is definitely white, even though I don't have much of a social circle, if I'm being honest. In Peoria, it was much more diverse. My main friends were still white, though. I did create a diverse group of clergy that I met with once a month, a small group, but we had we had 3 black pastors and 4 white pastors. Some were mainline, some were evangelical. We had a group, everybody was of a different denomination. It was really a good group. But I'm ashamed to say I can't remember the last time I went to a person of color's house. Though I can't say I visited someone's house socially more than a couple times in the last few years either. In Peoria, I was friends with Muslims, I was friends with the Jewish community, I was friends with people in the black community. Our church had a partnership with a predominantly black congregation. Here, I really haven't had that, and I'm starting to do that more, but I realize the circles I run in, professionally and socially, are very, very white. I do need to do a better job of diversifying my social and professional circles. I think this is evidence of how the system affects us. Even if we have no antagonism or dislike for people of color, we still find ourselves segregated. So Hessel writes, if you have a hard time feeling responsible for racism, you may have trouble considering your responsibility. If that's the case, it may be good to consider your response ability. To say you are responsible for something brings up feelings of defensiveness, perhaps anger, and these strong emotions make it difficult to hear others' perspectives, let alone build meaningful relationships. Often, persons sharing their frustrations about racism need you to simply hear them, not to take personal responsibility. You can be response able, having the ability to respond with compassion and care without needing to feel personally responsible. We often just get defensive or try to rationalize why a person of color receives certain treatment they found unjust. Perhaps it's our guilt or our fear that if there really is such a big problem as systemic racism, it will be impossible to solve, and that makes us feel bad, so we'd rather rationalize how it isn't really a problem rather than fail at solving it. When you hear someone share experiences of injustice or racism, you don't have to feel responsible for their fear or anger, but you can be response able by listening, believing, and accepting their experience. Have you ever had a person of color try to tell you about an experience of injustice or racism? How did you feel? What was your response? So in Peoria, I created that diverse clergy group of black and white pastors, though it was small enough to have good conversations. I also created a partnership with a predominantly black membership church, and through those relationships, we slowly built trust to the point where we could share those more difficult authentic, honest, raw feelings and experiences. One of my pastor friends became the president of the local NAACP chapter. He often shared his own experiences and experiences of his neighbors, and I often didn't know what to say. Sorry? I mean, sometimes I felt angry that these things happened, and what could I actually do about it? So then I felt powerless, which made me feel bad. Sometimes I admit I wondered if I wasn't getting the full story and if the person involved was partly to blame. Sometimes I just felt guilty. I finally learned a better way to respond from the classic kids' TV show, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. One of the songs says, "Saying I'm sorry is the first step. Then how can I help? Saying I'm sorry is the first step. Then how can I help?" I learned to express my grief that this happened to a friend, to say sorry and mean it, not out of a sense of guilt, but out of a genuine compassion that this happened. But then I learned to ask, what can I do to help make this right, or make it right in the future? And sometimes they would say there was nothing I could do, but other times they asked me to do concrete things like attend a meeting with black clergy with the mayor. They knew, whether they liked it or not, that having white clergy from larger affluent churches gave them more credibility and power. This was one way I could share my privilege and position for the sake of others. So I would go to those kind of meetings. Now, one cultural characteristic of WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, is that we're taught from an early age to keep our emotions in check and not get too angry. It's the whole British stiff upper lip thing. Keep calm, carry on. Even if your arm's off, pretend 'tis merely a flesh wound. I never realized this was part of a racial identity until I read Waking Up White a few years ago. We are often uncomfortable with large displays of emotion in the white community, especially anger. We often want everyone to keep calm and just carry on. But Hessel art encourages us to understand the role of anger in the work of justice. Anger about injustice, she says, propels us to make a difference. At the same time, anger can feel all-consuming, and so we need to take breaks from time to time from our anger. Sometimes people of color are angry, but they are afraid to express it because it could end up getting them hurt, or they could just be written off as an angry black man or an angry black woman. So that anger just builds and builds. You can be a safe person for someone to express that anger if you can build authentic, response-able relationships. So I wonder, do you think God is angry about injustices in the world? What is something that has happened at some point in the world's history that you kind of hope God is angry about? What injustice against you or someone you love make you angry enough to show that anger through actions, words, emotions? One of the most memorable lectures I attended in seminary was entitled "The Strange Fate of the Wrath of God." It traced how theologies around the wrath of God have changed over the centuries. We've gone from God appearing always angry, especially at us, to a docile God that's okay with everything, just really chill. Now, neither extreme is faithful to the biblical witness of who God is. Personally, I want God to be angry at things that happen in the world. I want God not to be okay with abuse and terrorism of all kinds. I hope God wasn't unaffected by the Holocaust. I hope God was angry and brokenhearted because I don't want to be more compassionate and invested in the lives of this world than the God who created it. I can often imagine, though, situations where my rage would boil over. But sometimes those situations are met, and I find a way to bury my rage and anger. I suppose this is the cultural conditioning or self-preservation, because I know what it could cost me if I ever actually showed that anger. We say, well, if people started taking away our kids, we wouldn't stand for it. But that happened in Germany, with children who had conditions like epilepsy. Even people in the Nazi Party, their children were taken away. And parents felt powerless and responsible for maybe their other kids, so they did nothing. I've sometimes imagined if I was a parent trying to desperately seek safety for Verity, what would it feel like to escape danger only to get to a place and have her separated from me? I've imagined her in a cage crying, wondering what has happened, wondering where her mommy and daddy are, and that just fills me with anger and rage, and I realize that is how some parents feel right now. There was even an English family who were over in Canada visiting and accidentally crossed an unmarked border. The parents were separated from their infant children for weeks and weeks. That angers me. Horrible things happen in the world all the time. But I've done nothing. And I might think, if it happened to me, what would I do? Would I calmly take it? If something horrible was happening to my children, would I get angry? Would I do anything about it? Would I just continue to play the game even though it's set up against me and there's nothing I can do to actually win? I've been watching a show called The English Game, and how the people responsible for soccer in the beginning were all the gentlemen, the upper elites, and they basically rigged the system against the teams that were from working class towns. And what could they do? They were powerless. They could riot. That would just hurt them more. They can quit, but then they don't get the advantages of the game. What can they do? That's the problem I often find myself. If you are faced with power that has absolute power, when it mistreats and misuses that power, what recourse do you have? And I'm thankful I've never found myself in that situation. But I'm trying to imagine what I would do if I did. So I'm angry, and yet I haven't done much about it. So the question I ask myself is, how would I react if these things were directly happening to me? And why do I not do as much when they are directly happening to my neighbors? How can I so easily reconcile my anger and do nothing? I suppose it's self-preservation, but I'm not sure that's a very good answer. And again, these aren't value judgments on all protesters, all police, or anything like that. But there are abuses of power. There are problems. And people are angry. And I need to deal with that instead of trying to explain it away and make it all nice and better so I don't have to engage with it. But that's often what my instinct is to do. So Hessel, the author, talks about political correctness. When you hear that phrase, what emotions or thoughts immediately come up? Do you find it confusing because the correct terminology can change over time, so it kind of feels like a moving target? You never know what's the politically correct thing to say. Sometimes political correctness frustrates us because it makes us feel judged, or like we suddenly can't say what we grew up saying. Who gets to make these rules anyway? But have you ever been on the receiving end of hurtful language? Has someone you loved been on the receiving end of hurtful language? Hessel says the problem with political correctness is with its assumed goal, not offending. If our only goal is avoiding offense or speaking so that people from across the political spectrum will not be offended by what we are saying, then we are working towards a weak goal. Not to offend others is a very low bar. It is easy to meet this benchmark by simply saying the things you know others want to hear. A much loftier goal is the call of Jesus Christ to love one another just as I have loved you. You should love one another. From John 13. Loving others means more than just not offending someone. To aim to not offend is the bare minimum, but it says nothing of your intention to love that person. Love requires something greater, to actually know that other person, to seek to know them and to love them. It means having compassion for how that person has suffered and to desire the best for them. Rather than simply avoid offending another, love means actively finding out ways to honor and care for them. So the goal shouldn't be to be politically correct. It's to not hurt others. is to not let language divide or demonize or degrade. Using the right language is one way of showing someone you have listened to them, you know them, you care enough about them to change your speech. If saying a phrase or a word you grew up with is more important than actually showing someone you care when they ask you to change your language, it's about you. You clearly don't actually want to love them. We might think we do and say, oh, well, they're too sensitive. But they're asking you to do something simple. And if we can't have the courtesy to do that, then let's not pretend we want to love them. Let's just say we want to do things our way, and anybody who doesn't like our way, well, tough cookies for you. And that's not love, so let's not pretend about this. I get a little fired up about this because I have personal feelings about people not being willing to accommodate when you have a simple request that can make a big difference, and people being like, I don't want to do that. I like doing things my way. Can you think of an example where you've intentionally tried to change the way you've said something or called something because it was the less harmful and more loving thing to do? And I admit, I have a mixed relationship with political correctness. At times, I'm angered by people who are so against it. Why would you not want to try to find ways not to offend and hurt others? Seems pretty simple. Seems pretty selfish. And other times, I'm frustrated by it because it's impossible not to offend someone. Language is difficult, and we will never get 100% agreement on language. Here's just one example. There are some people who want to be referred to as Latinx instead of Latina or Latino because Latinx doesn't assume binary gender. Others in that group want to remain Latina or Latino because they don't want to erase the role their biological gender has played in their successes, struggles, etc. There isn't a consensus on the language even within the community, so even when we are trying not to offend, we can offend. So what I'm learning to do is ask people what they would prefer, such as what pronouns that they would prefer. Would they like to be referred to as Native American, Indigenous people, Indians, etc.? And I hear a variety of answers. Sometimes they want to be referred to their nation or their tribe name. Some don't like the term tribe, some do like it. Others want to be called First Peoples, or some are actually fine with Indian. I have to take the time to ask and not assume. But if I'm going to be in a relationship with someone, I need to take the time to ask. Now, this is sometimes my concern with talking about race. Do I say African American, black, people of color? And there isn't one answer to this question. So I try to model the language that I read from those in the community I'm speaking about as best I can if I'm not speaking directly to someone who I can ask, what language would you prefer I use? That's just one simple way to show care and compassion for someone, to ask, what language can I use? To take the time to find out what language may have changed or been offensive, because you know what? Language does change. Society changes, laws change. We have to be able to change with it. So I want to look back at a couple questions as we reflect back on all of Chapter 2. Has anyone ever made accommodations for you that made you feel cared for, like changing language? Did they have to make those accommodations, or did they choose to? And how did that affect your relationship with them? Has someone ever taken the time to listen to your pain or complaint without judging you or trying to say why you shouldn't be so upset? How did that make you feel? So, as many of you know, Courtney, my wife, has a lot of food allergies. And since she has many food allergies, accommodations are needed if we're going to eat with anyone or out at any restaurants. It says a lot when some people treat it like it's some great burden for them to have to worry about whether she can eat or not. Other times people try really hard, and even though they may make a mistake and she can't eat anyway, we appreciate that they tried, or at least tried to think about how a meal or a restaurant would affect her. Sometimes people don't think of it at all and schedule meetings at restaurants where she can't eat, so she just has to sit there while everyone else is enjoying food. How do you think that makes her feel? It can make you feel like you don't matter when that happens. There was this true story that was shared like a year or so ago about a woman who had a life-threatening mushroom allergy, and her in-laws' family did not seem to care at all, even tried to make her eat food with mushrooms. So when she was over, they actually made almost everything with mushrooms, so she couldn't eat anything. She's like, I have this problem. And they're like, well, just try it. You don't know you're gonna die. How do you think that makes that person feel? A simple thing of just not cooking mushrooms. Like peanut allergies are a lot harder, or soy or gluten. It's in a lot of stuff, but mushrooms? They couldn't even not have mushrooms. And the thing was, at Thanksgiving, they said, well, our family tradition is to always have these mushrooms. So basically what they're saying is, our old family tradition is more important than you. Is that love? That's not a family I want to be a part of. And honestly, I get tired of commercials and things making fun of food allergies and being gluten-free. And people might say, oh, you're being too sensitive. It's just a joke. But it's a matter of health for my family. And the fact that some people joke about it or see it as some great burden they have to bear instead of a challenge that profoundly affects my family does anger me. And it makes me not like those people very much. It affects my relationship with them because they say, oh, it's just a joke, or oh, gluten-free stuff, it doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter. And if it does hurt someone's feeling, instead of trying to say why they shouldn't be hurt, maybe we should change how we joke. And this is true about sexist jokes, racist jokes, ageist jokes, and all these things. We say, well, where's the sense of humor anymore? Well, we haven't walked in someone else's shoes to know why that might hurt. It says a lot about us when our idea of humor is more important than someone else's feelings. We need to be able to change. But here's the flip side. When people do listen to the challenges without judging and do so in love and try to find ways to work with you, then you feel really loved. I remember being invited over to someone's house in Peoria, and they asked so many questions and went above and beyond to make sure Courtney could eat at their house. It felt good, and it felt welcoming, and it felt loving. I want to make sure my black, brown, Jewish, Islamic, etc. neighbors of all kinds feel that same intentional care from interactions with me. And that may mean I have to learn new things. I may have to change behaviors. I may have to change my language, change how I do things. But I think it's worth it to actually follow Jesus' commands to love one another. Because if we aren't willing to change that, then we aren't loving. It's not about political correctness or people being too sensitive. We always want to put it outside of ourselves. What it really comes down to is, what are we willing to do and to change and to learn and to adapt to love others where they are? Thank you for joining me today as we reflect on chapter 2. Next week, we'll look more at chapter 3 together.